1 year after 300 Spartans fell at Thermopylae, the Greek world stood on the edge of annihilation. Athens lay in ruins, burned twice by Persian forces. Refugees crowded the island of Salamis, homeless and desperate. The Persian general Mardonius commanded 300,000 soldiers in the plains of Boeotia, waiting to deliver the final blow. But the Greeks were no longer afraid. They were angry. In 479 BC, Sparta finally mobilized its full military strength. 10,000 Spartan warriors, accompanied by 35,000 Helot servants and allies from across Greece, marched north. Their mission was simple: avenge Leonidas and his 300, or die trying. What followed was the Battle of Plataea, the largest land battle of the ancient world. It was a clash that would determine the fate of Western civilization. Tonight, we explore this forgotten victory, the tactical brilliance, the desperate maneuvers, and the brutal price of freedom. This is the story of how the Spartans avenged their dead and saved Greece from the greatest empire the world had ever known. The winter of 480 BC was one of desperation for the Greek city-states. King Xerxes of Persia had retreated to Asia after his naval defeat at Salamis, but he left behind a formidable force. General Mardonius, Xerxes' cousin and most capable commander, remained in Greece with an army estimated at 300,000 men. Mardonius was not like his king. Where Xerxes was theatrical and prone to grand gestures, Mardonius was calculating and ruthless. He understood Greek politics better than many Greeks themselves. He knew the alliance between Sparta and Athens was fragile, held together only by shared fear of Persia. To exploit this weakness, Mardonius offered Athens a generous peace treaty. He proposed that Athens would remain autonomous, receive financial compensation for the destruction of their city, and become Persia's privileged ally in Greece. It was a tempting offer for a city reduced to ash and rubble. The Athenian assembly gathered on Salamis to debate the proposal. A counselor named Leonidas stood and suggested they consider the Persian terms. The response was immediate and horrifying. The other counselors surrounded him and stoned him to death on the floor of the assembly hall. When news spread through the refugee camps, Athenian women rushed to Leonidas' house, dragged his wife and children into the street, and killed them as well. This brutal act revealed the psychological state of the Greeks in early 479 BC. They were traumatized, homeless, and filled with a rage that demanded outlet. Diplomacy was no longer an option. There would be no negotiations with Persia. There would only be war. When Mardonius learned that Athens had rejected his offer, he responded with calculated cruelty. He marched his army back into Attica and systematically destroyed what remained of Athens. Every temple still standing was pulled down. Every house that had survived the first burning was razed. Athens was transformed from a ruined city into a graveyard of broken stone. The Athenians sent urgent messages to Sparta. Their tone was no longer pleading. It was threatening. They told the Spartan ephors that if Sparta did not immediately send its army north, Athens would accept the Persian alliance and turn its powerful navy against the Peloponnese. Sparta's defensive walls would mean nothing if Athens helped Persia land troops behind them. For weeks, Sparta had been stalling, hoping to avoid a direct confrontation. They were building a defensive wall across the Isthmus of Corinth, planning to seal off the Peloponnese and let northern Greece fall to Persia. It was a strategy born of self-preservation, not honor, but the threat of an Athenian-Persian alliance changed everything. In a single night, the ephors issued mobilization orders unprecedented in Spartan history. They didn't send a token force. They emptied the city. 5,000 Spartiates, the elite warrior class, prepared for war. But more remarkably, they armed and mobilized their helots. For every Spartan citizen, 7 helot slaves were given weapons and ordered to march. 35,000 helots joined the column, the largest mobilization of Sparta's underclass in recorded history. Combined with 5,000 allies from the Perioikoi communities surrounding Sparta, a force of 45,000 men assembled in secrecy. They marched north before dawn, moving with such speed and stealth that by the time Athenian envoys arrived in Sparta the next morning to demand action, the Spartan ephors simply pointed to the empty barracks and said the army was already at the border. The hunt for Mardonius had begun. Mardonius received reports of the Spartan mobilization with satisfaction, not alarm. He had been waiting for this moment. His strategy was never to defend Athens or occupy Greek cities. Cities could not be held without the cooperation of their citizens. Instead, Mardonius sought a decisive battle on terrain that favored Persian tactics. He withdrew his entire army from Attica and moved north into Boeotia, the agricultural heartland of central Greece. There, near the city of Thebes, he found the perfect battlefield, the plains of Plataea. The location was chosen with precision. The plains were flat and expansive, ideal for cavalry maneuvers. The Aspis River provided a natural boundary and water source. Most importantly, the open ground nullified the primary Greek advantage, the phalanx formation that was nearly invincible in narrow passes but vulnerable on open plains. Mardonius ordered the construction of a massive fortified camp. His engineers built a wooden stockade nearly a mile square, with walls tall enough to provide protection and towers for observation. It was a fortress capable of housing his entire army, with supplies sufficient for months. Then he waited. As the allied Greek forces began arriving at the southern edge of the plain, they faced an impossible dilemma. They could see the Persian camp clearly from the foothills of Mount Cithaeron. The sight was terrifying, an ocean of tents, thousands of horses grazing by the river, and the glint of armor from the Immortals, Persia's elite infantry. The Greek commanders, led by the Spartan regent Pausanias, understood immediately that marching onto the plain would be suicide. Persian cavalry would surround and destroy them, so they refused to descend. They positioned their forces on the rocky slopes where cavalry could not operate effectively. For days, the two armies stared at each other across the valley. Mardonius grew impatient. He had not remained in Greece to wait indefinitely. He decided to test Greek resolve by sending his cavalry to harass their positions. The Persian cavalry commander was a man named Mecistius, one of the most respected figures in the Persian army. He rode a magnificent Nisaean stallion with a bridle made of gold. Leading his cavalry up the slopes, Mecistius and his men circled the Greek positions, launching arrows and shouting insults. The Greeks, unable to respond effectively to these hit-and-run tactics, began taking casualties. The Megarian contingent, positioned on exposed ground, sent an urgent message to Pausanias: "Send reinforcements or we will withdraw." 300 Athenian volunteers, accompanied by archers, rushed down to support the Megarians. In the chaotic skirmish that followed, fortune favored the Greeks. An arrow struck Mecistius's horse, causing it to rear and throw its rider to the ground. The Athenians swarmed forward to kill the fallen commander, but Mecistius wore scale armor beneath his tunic that their weapons could not penetrate. He fought back fiercely until a Greek soldier drove a spear through the eye-hole of his helmet. The Persian commander fell dead. The Persian cavalry charged desperately to recover Mecistius's body, but the Greeks held firm. They lifted the corpse onto a cart and paraded it through their ranks. The death of such a respected figure provided an enormous morale boost. First blood had been drawn. But Pausanias knew this small victory meant nothing. Mardonius was watching from the valley floor, and his patience was running out. The real battle was yet to come. The death of Mecistius emboldened the Greek commanders. Pausanias, seeing that his army could defend against cavalry attacks, decided to move closer to water. The Greek position on the upper slopes of Mount Cithaeron was defensible, but it was far from reliable water sources. In the August heat, with tens of thousands of men in bronze armor, thirst was a constant threat. Pausanias ordered the entire Greek line to shift positions. 100,000 men moved down from the foothills toward the Asopus River, settling near a vital spring called the Gargaphia Spring. It seemed like a sound tactical decision, better water access while still maintaining distance from the Persian camp. Mardonius watched this movement with interest. He made no attempt to attack. Instead, he recognized what the Greeks had done. By moving closer to the Persian position, they had extended their supply lines. The mountain passes behind them, through which food and equipment traveled from the Peloponnese, were now exposed and vulnerable. Mardonius gave orders to his cavalry commanders. Their mission was not to engage the Greek infantry. It was to cut their supply lines and starve them into submission. Persian horsemen circled around the Greek army and struck the mountain passes. They found a massive supply convoy of 500 wagons carrying grain, wine, and dried meat from the Peloponnese. The cavalry slaughtered the drivers, killed the oxen, and set the wagons ablaze. In a single afternoon, the Greek army's food supply was destroyed. For 8 days, the two armies remained in position. The Greeks watched helplessly as Persian cavalry patrolled the plains, launching occasional arrow volleys but never committing to a full assault. Each day, hunger grew more acute. Rations were cut, then cut again. Men began collapsing from heat and malnutrition. The Greek commanders argued constantly. The Athenians wanted to attack immediately, believing that any action was better than slow starvation. The Corinthians advocated retreat, arguing that the army should fall back to more defensible positions with secure supply lines. The Spartans, trained in endurance and discipline, urged patience. Pausanias held the coalition together through force of will, but the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Every day the Persians controlled the supply routes was another day closer to the army's dissolution. Discipline began to fray. Minor skirmishes broke out between different Greek contingents over diminishing food supplies. On the 11th day, Mardonius decided to end the stalemate. He ordered his cavalry to attack the Greeks' most critical asset, their water supply. Persian horsemen rode directly to the Gargaphia spring and systematically destroyed it. They drove their horses through the water, churning the clear spring into an undrinkable mixture of mud and silt. The Greeks now faced catastrophe: no food, no water, enemy cavalry controlling all approach routes. In the scorching August heat, men were dying of thirst faster than they were dying from arrows. Pausanias called an emergency council of war. The Greek commanders gathered as the sun set on the 11th day, knowing that by morning the army would begin to disintegrate. Soldiers would break ranks to search for water. Units would retreat without orders. The carefully maintained coalition would collapse into chaos. Pausanias made the only decision possible. The army would retreat during the night to a position called the Island, a defensive area closer to Mount Cithaeron with access to fresh water. It was an incredibly dangerous maneuver, conducting a tactical withdrawal at night, in silence, with an enemy army just hundreds of yards away. The plan required perfect coordination. Every contingent would move simultaneously at the second watch of the night. Absolute silence was mandatory. If the Persians detected the movement and attacked during the retreat, the Greek army would be destroyed. As darkness fell over the plains of Plataea, 100,000 men prepared to move. They did not know they were about to execute one of the most disastrous retreats in military history. The night retreat began at the appointed hour. In theory, it was a sound plan. In practice, it revealed the fundamental weakness of the Greek coalition. They were not a unified army, but a collection of independent city-states with different commanders, different priorities, and different levels of discipline. The center of the Greek line, composed of contingents from Corinth, Megara, and smaller city-states, received the order to withdraw. But these men were not Spartans. They had not been trained from childhood to obey orders regardless of circumstances. They were citizen soldiers who had watched their comrades die of thirst for days while the enemy taunted them from across the river. When the signal came to retreat, they did not move in orderly fashion. They panicked, they grabbed their shields and ran. They did not stop at the designated rallying point. They kept running all the way back to the town of Plataea itself, where they huddled around the temple of Hera, effectively removing themselves from the battle. In the span of an hour, the Greek army lost half its strength, not to enemy action, but to fear. Meanwhile, on the right wing where the Spartans were positioned, a different problem emerged. One of the Spartan commanders, a captain named Amampharaetus, refused to obey the retreat order. He was the leader of the Pitanit Loshos, one of Sparta's most prestigious military units. When Pausanias gave the order to withdraw, Amampharaetus stood firm. He told his men they would not move. To a Spartan raised on the legend of Thermopylae, retreat was unthinkable. He did not care about tactics or strategy. He cared about honor. Pausanias, the supreme commander of the entire Greek alliance, found himself in an impossible situation. He was standing in the darkness, trying to conduct a silent retreat, while one of his own captains openly defied him. The two men began arguing in harsh whispers that grew louder. Other Spartan commanders tried to intervene. The precious minutes of darkness were slipping away. Finally, Amampharaetus picked up a large stone from the riverbed. He held it up in the moonlight and threw it down at Pausanias's feet. In Spartan democracy, citizens voted by placing pebbles in urns. Amampharaetus was mockingly using a boulder to cast his vote. He would stay and die rather than retreat. The Athenians, positioned on the left wing, sent a messenger to find out why the Spartans had not begun moving. The messenger arrived to find Spartan commanders screaming at each other while the army stood motionless. Dawn was approaching. The carefully planned retreat was falling apart. Pausanias made a desperate decision. He ordered the main Spartan force to begin retreating, hoping that once Amampharaetus saw himself being left behind, he would swallow his pride and follow. It was a gamble with thousands of lives. The Spartan column began moving south, constantly looking back. For agonizing minutes, Amampharaetus and his men remained in place. Then, finally, as the main force disappeared into the darkness, Amampharaetus cracked. He ordered his unit to jog after the departing Spartans. But it was too late. The sky was turning gray. Birds began singing. The sun crested over the mountains. Across the river, Persian sentries rubbed their eyes and looked at the Greek positions. The center was gone. The Athenians were far away on one side, obscured by hills, and on the other side, clearly visible on the open slopes, were the Spartans, strung out in a long, disorganized column, completely exposed. General Mardonius stepped out of his tent. He saw the scattered Spartan formation and smiled. He had been in Greece for nearly a year, waiting for the perfect opportunity to destroy the Spartan army. That opportunity had arrived. He didn't convene his officers for a complex battle plan. He did not organize his infantry into careful formations. He simply pointed at the retreating Spartans and gave a single order: "Get them!" The Persian army surged forward. Cavalry thundered across the river. Infantry followed in a massive, chaotic charge. There was no strategy, no formation, just the primal joy of hunters chasing wounded prey. Pausanias heard the roar first. He turned and saw the horizon fill with dust and glinting spears. He looked at his scattered column, at the Athenians too far away to help, at his allies hiding in Plataea. 10,000 Spartans and 35,000 lightly armed helots stood alone against the entire Persian Empire. The Battle of Plataea had officially begun, and the Spartans were caught completely unprepared. The Spartans found themselves in a nightmare scenario. They were not in battle formation. They were spread out across the slopes in a marching column, disorganized and vulnerable. Persian cavalry swarmed around their flanks. Persian archers, tens of thousands strong, planted their wicker shields in the ground and began shooting. The sky darkened with arrows. Thousands of projectiles arced through the morning air and rained down on the exposed Spartans. Men fell screaming as arrows found gaps in their armor, the neck, the groin, the unarmored backs of knees. The natural human response would be to either charge forward in rage or run in terror. Pausanias ordered neither. Instead, he commanded the Spartans to halt, drop to one knee, and raise their shields. Then, with arrows clattering against bronze all around him, he turned his back on the enemy. He called for a priest. In ancient Greek warfare, you did not fight without divine approval. A goat was brought forward. Pausanias drew his knife and cut the animal's throat. He examined the liver for omens, searching for signs from the gods. The omens were negative. The gods said no, so Pausanias waited. Imagine being a Spartan soldier in that moment. You are crouching behind your shield. You can hear the constant thud of arrows striking bronze. You can hear your comrades screaming as arrows pierce their flesh. Your general is not giving the order to attack. He is standing there, staring at a goat's entrails, shaking his head. The Spartans held their position. This was the ultimate test of their training, their discipline, their entire way of life. Lesser armies would have broken and run. But the Spartans had been raised from childhood to obey orders without question, to endure suffering without complaint, to stand firm even when every instinct screamed to flee. Behind each Spartan crouched a helot slave. These men had no bronze armor. They had wicker shields or leather coverings. They were servants forced to march to war by masters who oppressed them. And now they were dying in droves, struck down by arrows while their masters stood like statues. One of the casualties was a Spartan named Callicrates. Ancient historians describe him as the most beautiful man in the Greek army. An arrow struck him in the side. As he lay dying, he was carried to the rear. His last words were recorded. "I do not grieve for my death. I grieve because I die without having struck a blow." Another goat was brought forward. Its throat was cut. The liver was examined. The omens were still unfavorable. The slaughter continued. The Persian infantry, emboldened by the lack of Greek response, moved closer. They were now within shouting distance, pouring arrows into the motionless ranks. The Tegean allies, positioned on the Spartan flank, began to shift restlessly. Their discipline was breaking. Pausanias looked up at the temple of Hera on the distant hill. Tears streamed down his face. He raised his arms and screamed a prayer to the goddess, begging her not to let them die in shame without fighting. The seconds stretched into minutes, the minutes into what felt like hours. Men were dying in the passive, industrial manner of a slaughter, unable to defend themselves while their commander waited for divine approval. Finally, just as the Tegeans were about to charge on their own in defiance of orders, a third goat was sacrificed. Pausanias looked down at the entrails. The liver was favorable. The omens had changed. Pausanias stood. He didn't need to give a speech. He didn't need to blow a trumpet. He simply raised his spear. The transformation was instant. 10,000 men who had been frozen in place, absorbing punishment with inhuman discipline, suddenly exploded into motion. All the rage, all the frustration, all the pent-up fury of standing helpless while comrades died, it was all released in a single, terrible charge. The Spartans did not jog. They sprinted. The bronze phalanx crashed into the Persian line with the force of an avalanche. The storm of arrows was over. The butchery was about to begin. The collision of the two armies was not the romantic clash of swords depicted in art. It was the sickening crunch of wood shattering under bronze, the screams of men crushed under the weight of the charge, the wet sound of spears punching through flesh. The Persians had erected a wall of wicker shields to protect their archers. Against light infantry, these shields were effective. Against a charging Spartan phalanx, they were useless. The front rank of Spartans hit the barrier with such force that it simply disintegrated. Persian archers were trampled before they could draw their swords. Now the battle entered the phase the Greeks called the othismos, the shoving match. This was where the fundamental difference between Greek and Persian warfare became decisive. The Persians were brave. Ancient sources make this clear. They grabbed Spartan spears with their bare hands and tried to snap the shafts. They threw themselves at the wall of shields with daggers and short swords, desperately seeking gaps. They fought with the courage of lions. But courage could not overcome technology and physics. Persian soldiers wore linen tunics or scale armor designed to stop arrows, not the heavy thrusts of 8-foot spears driven by men who had trained for war since childhood. When a Persian struck a Spartan, his blade often bounced off curved bronze. When a Spartan struck a Persian, he went through bone. Once the initial spears shattered, the Spartans drew their xiphos, the short leaf-shaped sword designed for close-quarters killing. They moved with mechanical efficiency. Stab to the face, bash with the shield rim, step forward over the corpse, repeat. The helots, who had suffered passively under the arrow storm, now swarmed into the gaps. Armed with javelins, slings, and daggers, they finished wounded Persians that the Spartans knocked down. It became an industrial slaughter. Dust rose so thick that men fought by sound and shadow. The screaming was constant, Persian commands mixing with the guttural roars of Greeks releasing months of accumulated rage. In the center of the chaos rode General Mardonius on a magnificent white horse. Unlike King Xerxes, who had watched battles from a distant throne, Mardonius was in the thick of the fighting. He was surrounded by his elite bodyguard of 1,000 picked men, cutting down any Spartan who broke ranks. His presence held the Persian army together. As long as they could see that white horse and the general's purple cloak, the Persians continued fighting, despite horrific casualties. The Spartans saw him too. They recognized that killing Mardonius would end the battle. The phalanx began grinding its way toward the man on the white horse. They ignored the gold jewelry worn by fallen Persians. They ignored the expensive fabrics and weapons. They wanted one prize, the head of the man who had burned Athens. The circle of bodyguards around Mardonius began to shrink. The elite Persians fought with desperate ferocity, throwing themselves at the advancing wall of bronze. Bodies piled so high that the Spartans had to climb over corpses to get closer. A Spartan named Arimnestos spotted Mardonius rising above the melee. Aramnestos was a warrior of great renown whose name translates to the one who is remembered. On this day, he earned that name. He lunged forward with his spear. The blow struck Mardonius with catastrophic force. Some accounts say a rock crushed his skull. Others say a spear pierced his chest. The result was the same. The general of the Persian Empire, cousin of King Xerxes, fell from his white horse and crashed into the bloody dirt. He did not rise. The moment Mardonius died, the sound of battle changed. The roar of the Persian army faltered. Ancient armies were like living organisms. Kill the head and the body dies. The elite immortals who had never retreated in their history threw down their weapons and ran. Artabazus, the second in command of Persian forces, had been holding 40,000 men in reserve. He had the strength to flank the Spartans and potentially win the battle. But Artabazus was a survivor, not a hero. He watched Mardonius fall from a distance. He saw the Spartan phalanx grinding forward. He calculated his odds. Then he turned his horse around and ordered his 40,000 men to march in the opposite direction, not back to camp, but straight out of Greece. He abandoned the Persian army to its fate. The remaining Persians, leaderless and terrified, fled in panic toward the wooden stockade they had built. They scrambled inside, barred the gates, and climbed the towers, hoping the walls would protect them. They were wrong. They had just trapped themselves in a cage with a predator. The Spartans arrived at the walls of the Persian stockade. Here, they faced an unexpected problem. Spartans were masters of open field combat, but they had no experience with siege warfare. They could not climb walls or breach gates. For a brief moment, the Persians held them at bay with arrow volleys from the towers. Then the Athenians arrived. They'd been fighting pro-Persian Greeks on the opposite side of the battlefield. Hearing of the victory against Mardonius, they rushed to join the Spartans. And unlike the Spartans, the Athenians understood engineering. The Athenians identified a weak point in the wooden rampart and tore down a section of wall. Through that breach poured the combined fury of Spartans and Athenians. What happened inside the Persian camp was not a battle, it was an execution. The Greeks took no prisoners, they accepted no surrenders. They moved through the crowded enclosure where tens of thousands of Persians were trapped, and they killed methodically. All the accumulated trauma of the war, the burning of Athens, the deaths at Thermopylae, the months of hunger and thirst, was unleashed on the trapped soldiers. The ground became a mixture of mud and blood. Ancient sources claim that of the 260,000 Persians who had stayed with Mardonius, only 3,000 survived. While these numbers are likely exaggerated, archaeological evidence confirms that an entire generation of Persian manpower was destroyed in a single afternoon. When the killing finally stopped, silence fell over the battlefield. The Spartans and Athenians stood among the carnage, exhausted and covered in blood. Then they began to notice something else. They were standing on a fortune. The Persian camp was not just a military base, it was a mobile palace. Mardonius had inherited King Xerxes' personal tent and furnishings, gold mixing bowls, silver tables, tapestries woven with purple dye, chests overflowing with coined money. For the Spartans, who used heavy iron bars as currency specifically to discourage hoarding, it was incomprehensible wealth. Pausanias walked into Mardonius's pavilion, still in his battle-stained armor. He saw the silk hangings and gold furniture. He saw the Persian chefs cowering in the corner. Instead of killing them, he gave them a strange order. Prepare a meal exactly as you would have prepared it for Mardonius. The chefs roasted exotic meats, baked soft breads, and laid out a feast on silver platters. Then, Pausanias ordered his Spartan cooks to prepare a standard military meal: lentils, pork blood, and vinegar boiled into the infamous black broth. He placed the two meals side by side. He called his commanders into the tent and pointed to the contrast. "Look at how the Persians lived," he said. "They had all this luxury, yet they came here to rob us, who have so little." It was a moment of profound irony. The Persians, the wealthiest empire on earth, had invaded Greece to acquire more. The Greeks, who had almost nothing, had fought to preserve what little they possessed. That contrast became the defining image of the entire war. But it was also a warning that Pausanias himself would fail to heed. On the same day as the Battle of Plataea, according to legend, the Greek fleet attacked Persian forces at Mycale on the coast of Asia Minor. They burned Persian ships and slaughtered the garrison. In a single coordinated strike, Persia lost its army in Europe and its navy in the Aegean. The Persian Wars were over. Greece was saved. But the victory brought its own costs. The alliance between Sparta and Athens, held together by shared fear of Persia, began to fracture immediately. Athens rebuilt its walls and formed the Delian League, transforming from a defender of freedom into an imperial power demanding tribute from weaker states. Sparta retreated into isolation, suspicious of Athens's growing strength. And Pausanias, the hero of Plataea, underwent a transformation that scandalized the Greek world. He began wearing Persian robes. He hired Persian bodyguards. He dined on Persian luxuries. Rumors spread that he was secretly negotiating with King Xerxes, offering to betray Greece in exchange for power and a royal marriage. The Spartans recalled him and put him on trial, but lacked sufficient evidence to convict him. Pausanias continued his intrigues, allegedly promising freedom to the Helot slaves if they would help him overthrow the Spartan government. Finally, the ephors gathered proof of his treachery. When they moved to arrest him, Pausanias fled to the temple of Athena of the Brazen House, claiming sanctuary. The ephors could not enter the temple to kill him without offending the gods, so they sealed the doors with bricks. Legend says that as the Spartans gathered stones, Pausanias's own mother walked through the crowd. She did not weep or plead. She picked up a stone, placed it on the threshold, and walked away. She chose Sparta's honor over her son's life. Pausanias sat in the darkness of the temple for days, dying slowly of starvation. Just before his heart stopped, the ephors dragged his emaciated body outside so he would not die on sacred ground. The man who had saved Greece died as a traitor, starved to death by his own people. This is why Plataea is forgotten while Thermopylae is celebrated. Thermopylae is clean. The 300 die nobly. They become martyrs, frozen forever in their moment of heroic sacrifice. Plataea is messy. The heroes become villains. Victory leads to greed and corruption. The war crimes are uncomfortable to remember. But Plataea was the salvation. It was on those dusty plains that 10,000 Spartans proved that a free people could defeat the greatest empire in the world. It was brutal. It was savage, and it was necessary. When you hear about the 300 Spartans, remember the 10,000 who came after them. Remember the revenge, remember the victory, and remember the price that victory demanded. The Battle of Plataea ended on a hot August afternoon in 479 BC, but its consequences would echo through the centuries. To understand the true significance of what happened on those blood-soaked plains, we must examine what came after, both for Greece and for the individuals who fought there. In the immediate aftermath, the Greeks gathered to divide the spoils and honor their dead. The wealth captured from the Persian camp was staggering. A tenth was set aside as an offering to Apollo at Delphi, where a bronze column supported by 3 intertwined serpents was erected. That column, remarkably, still stands today in Istanbul, a physical remnant of this ancient victory. The remaining treasure was distributed among the city-states according to their contributions to the battle. But even this division planted seeds of future conflict. Athens believed it deserved a larger share given its role at Salamis and its sacrifice in allowing the city to be burned. Sparta insisted on strict proportional distribution based on the number of soldiers each city provided at Plataea. These arguments over money would fester and contribute to the eventual breakdown of the alliance. The Greek coalition also had to decide what to do with the Greeks who had sided with Persia. The city of Thebes, which had provided Mardonius with supplies and intelligence, was besieged after the battle. The Theban leaders who had collaborated with Persia were executed. Other pro-Persian cities were stripped of their defenses and forced to pay reparations. The victory at Plataea was followed by a brutal reckoning for those who had chosen the wrong side. For the Helots who had fought alongside their Spartan masters, there was no reward of freedom, no recognition of their sacrifice. They had died in the thousands under the arrow storm. They had fought in the final slaughter inside the Persian stockade. But when the victory celebrations began, they were ordered back to their fields and workshops. Their service changed nothing about their status as property of the Spartan state. This injustice would haunt Sparta for generations. Many historians believe that Pausanias' later attempt to incite a Helot rebellion was motivated partly by guilt over how these men had been treated after Plataea. He had commanded them in battle, seen them fight and die with courage equal to any Spartan, and then watched them return to slavery. That contradiction, asking men to fight for freedom while denying them their own, was a wound that never healed. The alliance between Sparta and Athens, which had seemed unbreakable during the Persian invasions, lasted less than 3 decades after Plataea. By 431 BC, just 48 years after standing together against Persia, Sparta and Athens were locked in the Peloponnesian War, a catastrophic conflict that would last 27 years and ultimately destroy both states as major powers. Historians still debate whether the Persian Wars made the Peloponnesian War inevitable. Athens emerged from Plataea with enormous confidence and a powerful navy. They transformed the Delian League from a defensive alliance into an empire, forcing weaker states to pay tribute and crushing revolts with brutal efficiency. The Athenians became, in many ways, what they had fought against: an imperial power extracting wealth from subjects. Sparta watched this transformation with growing alarm. The defensive, land-based power that had saved Greece now saw Athens building walls, constructing fleets, and gathering allies across the Aegean. The two cities had fundamentally different visions for what Greece should become. War between them became a matter of when, not if. The Battle of Plataea also established patterns of warfare that would define Greek military thinking for centuries: the supremacy of heavy infantry, the phalanx formation, and the importance of discipline became the foundation of Greek tactical doctrine. Alexander the Great, fighting nearly a century and a half later, would use an evolved version of the phalanx to conquer the Persian Empire completely. Yet Plataea also revealed the limitations of the Greek way of war. The Spartans' inability to conduct siege warfare, Their vulnerability on open plains against cavalry and their dependence on short campaigns due to agricultural obligations, all these weaknesses were exposed. Future Greek commanders would have to adapt or face defeat. For Persia, the defeat at Plataea marked the end of westward expansion, but not the end of Persian power. The empire remained vast and wealthy, stretching from Egypt to India. Xerxes returned to Persepolis and continued to rule for another 15 years. The loss of the Greek campaign was humiliating but not crippling. However, Plataea did establish a psychological barrier. For generations afterward, Persian kings would view Greece as cursed ground, not worth the cost of conquest. When Persia did intervene in Greek affairs in later decades, it was through bribery and diplomacy, not military invasion. The memory of Mardonius's defeat was too fresh, the cost too high. The battle also demonstrated something that would become a recurring theme in Western military history. A free people fighting for their homes could defeat a much larger force fighting for an emperor. This lesson would be invoked countless times across the centuries, by Romans facing Germanic tribes, by medieval cities resisting feudal lord, by revolutionaries fighting monarchies. Whether this lesson is always true is debatable. The Greeks had many advantages beyond their love of freedom: superior armor, better training, knowledge of the terrain. But the narrative that emerged from Plataea was powerful. Liberty makes soldiers fight harder than tyranny ever could. And what of Pausanias, whose brilliance and discipline saved Greece, only to die in disgrace? His story remains one of the great tragedies of ancient history. Modern historians debate whether he truly became a traitor or was simply a victim of Spartan paranoia and political intrigue. Some evidence suggests his Persian behavior was exaggerated by his enemies to justify his execution. What is certain is that Pausanias was a man caught between two worlds. He had commanded the greatest military coalition in Greek history. He had outsmarted one of Persia's best generals. He had seen the wealth and sophistication of the Persian Empire up close. When he returned to austere, rigid, suspicious Sparta, the contrast must have been jarring. Perhaps he could not reconcile being treated as just another citizen after having commanded kings and tyrants. Perhaps exposure to Persian culture genuinely changed him. Or perhaps Sparta itself had become too narrow, too frightened of change, too willing to sacrifice its heroes to preserve its mythology. His mother's choice to place that first stone remains one of the most chilling moments in ancient history. It represents the ultimate triumph of state over family, duty over love, ideology over humanity. Whether we should admire that devotion or recoil from it is a question each generation must answer for itself. The Battle of Plataea stands as a reminder that history is never simple. There are no pure heroes, no perfect victories, no wars without consequences. The men who saved Western civilization at Plataea were brutal, complicated, flawed humans who committed atrocities and died from their own contradictions. But they also did something extraordinary. They stood on a dusty plain against impossible odds and refused to break. They proved that will and discipline could overcome numerical superiority. They bought time for Athens to become the birthplace of democracy and philosophy. They preserved the Greek experiment for future generations to build upon. When we remember the Battle of Plataea, we remember not just a military victory but a choice. The Greeks could have accepted Persian peace terms. They could have lived comfortable lives under imperial rule, keeping their local customs while bowing to a distant emperor. Many cities made that choice. But Athens and Sparta chose differently. They chose freedom even when it meant destruction. They chose to fight even when survival seemed impossible. And in that choice, they defined something fundamental about what it means to be free, that some prices are too high to pay, even survival itself. The 300 Spartans at Thermopylae will always be remembered for their sacrifice, but it was the 10,000 at Plataea who turned that sacrifice into salvation. They avenged their dead. They saved their civilization. And they proved that sometimes the unglamorous victory matters more than the beautiful defeat. The dust has long since settled on the plains of Boeotia. The blood has washed away. The wooden stockade has rotted into nothing. But the choice made there, to fight for freedom regardless of the cost, echoes still across the millennia, a reminder that the greatest victories are often the ones we almost lost.